Let's talk about the layers panel, which is such an important part for anybody using Photoshop to design graphics or just to edit photos. We're going to be doing a lot in the layers panel throughout this course, and it's something when I opened up Photoshop and I started playing around the first time, I didn't really pay attention to the layers panel, and it made the way that I edited photos and created graphics really funky and not the right way to do it. So understanding how this works is important. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what's going on here in the layers panel. And then throughout the rest of the course, there will be other things that I don't cover in this video that you'll learn specifically for projects that we'll be covering. And you'll learn all the basic things you need to know about the layers panel. So I'm going to bring this out right here just so we can see it a little bit better. So what's going on here is we have our different layers. We kind of learned before that you can turn on and off layers, and you can see that if I turn off this number 3 and number 2 layer, that the layers disappear and only the first one appears, depending on which ones we have visible. We can change the order of layers. Think of them as layers on top of each other by dragging them down beneath the different layers. So we can put 3 and 2 beneath 1. Say we want to layer it 1, 2, 3. And this, you can really tell what happens when we move this around. So say we have layer 1 and we want to move it up. And then if we want to move layer 3 down, well, one thing we want to do, and you might want to do when moving around layers, is actually turn this auto select button off. You can see that even if I select layer 3 and then I try to click in here and move it, it's auto selecting that number 2 layer because that's where I'm clicking. So turn that auto select off, select your third layer or a layer below, and then just click and drag. And now no matter where I click and drag, I'm selecting that third layer. Even if I'm trying to click that layer 1, I can't select that unless I go over here, select layer 1 and move it around. Or if you do have the auto select layer open, you can click and choose and it does auto select. But if there is a layer below, it's kind of hard to get to it. For each of these layers, there's different properties. There's this drop down that says normal. This is the blending mode. We have a couple lessons specifically on that. And then opacity. So with opacity, there's different ways to change. So you can click down this drop down and it brings up a slider that you can drag to the left or right to make it more opaque or less opaque. Or you can literally just click the word opacity and drag to the left or right to drop or increase the opacity. Or you can click the number and type in a specific number and then press return on your keyboard. Now, the easiest way is just to click and drag, so there's really no point in dropping down this slider to bring it open. Below the opacity and the blending mode are some different lock options for locking the position or everything about the layer. So if you click this lock all button, you can't do anything to this layer. You can't add effects. You can't do anything. Just locking the position with this button will disable being able to move this layer, but you can still add effects and things like that. Over here on the right is the fill percentage. This is a little bit tricky to understand, but what I can do is just run through a quick example so you know. An easy way to add a stroke to an object is just by double clicking, and this opens up the layer style window. Then there's different layer styles, but I'm just going to click this stroke. For now, you can set the stroke settings right here. I'm just going to keep it that blue and select OK. And now you see that it's added this effect, which is the stroke, and you can turn on and off these effects by clicking the eyeball button right there. But now we can see what opacity versus fill does. So if I drop opacity, what it's doing is dropping the opacity of the actual object content itself, which is that red rectangle with the number 1. It's not dropping the opacity of the layer style that I added or the effects that I added. Opacity, on the other hand, drops the opacity for everything. So if I drop this down to 0, it disappears. If I drop the fill down to 0, only the inside goes down to 0, only the content itself. So that's what fill is. Now to get rid of these layer styles, I'm just going to right click and say clear layer styles for now. Down below here, we have some other buttons and options. Without any layers selected, the first few are disabled, but with them selected, you have effects. So you can do things like bevel and emboss, add stroke, basically what I just went to. You have layer masks, another completely different topic we'll talk about later. Creating a new fill or adjustment layer for this layer, or grouping different objects. So one way to organize your layers panel is, say you have different objects that combine different elements, you can actually group them together. Say I wanted to group all 3 of these objects together, I can just click this group button, and that adds that group 1. I can double click and call this layers 1 through 3 or whatever, and then just drag each of these layers or select multiple by clicking and then command clicking or control clicking if you're on a PC, the layers that you want to move, and dragging them into that group. And then you can rearrange them in that group, and you can close this down, turn it on or off, and that affects the entire group. This is really important to understand so that when you do have a project that has lots and lots of layers, then you can organize it properly. I think Adobe Photoshop has the ability to have thousands of layers. You would never really use that many, but it is there for an option. And obviously, if you had a project that had thousands of layers, a group like this would be really nice. The difference between grouping and what linking is, which I'll talk about next, is that within the group, we can still edit these layers individually. I'm going to get rid of this group by just selecting all of these layers by selecting the top one, holding down Shift, and then clicking the last one, and dragging it outside of the group. And then I'm just going to select this group and delete it just by pressing the trash can or delete on my keyboard. If I select all of these layers or multiple layers, you see this link option pop up. So without 2 layers selected, you can't select link. If I have 2 or more, I have this link option. And if I click that, you see this little chain link appear. Now, whatever I do to either of these layers happens to both. So I can resize them, I can move them around, I can do anything, and it happens to both. So that might be helpful if you're designing a logo or something that has multiple shapes or text on it and you want to link them together. You can unlink them by pressing the link button again. Down here at the bottom, you also have a create a new layer button. Now, when you create a new layer, you have to think of it as a transparent layer. There's nothing on this layer. So even if I turn it on and off, nothing is happening. Say I take my brush tool over here, and when my brush tool is selected, you have your different modifying options. So I can change the size and the hardness, the opacity, the mode, and I could also select the color. I can select the color by clicking this color down here where it's black and changing it to whatever color I want. And then when I brush onto this layer, this actually happens onto this layer 1. Imagine this as a clear piece of glass at the beginning, and now we start to layer it, paint on, it's on that piece of glass. And we can turn it on and off. We can put it beneath different layers if we want. If we had layer 1 selected, and we have the brush selected, if I try to paint for the first time, what happens is that it won't let me. It won't let me because this layer is what it calls a smart object. And a smart object is basically a vector object, which doesn't really help explain it to you if you're a beginner, but it's an object where I can resize it bigger or smaller, however much I want, and it won't become pixelated. When I rasterize an object, or if you have a photo that is rasterized, that means the resolution of that image is set. So if I increase or decrease the size of that image, then it might get pixelated if I make it bigger. But you have to have images rasterized or layers rasterized if you want to paint on them. So I'm just going to select OK. Don't worry if that's a little bit confusing. We're going to go over all these things and you're going to learn throughout this course as we do different projects even better. But now we have this layer 1, it's rasterized. And if I paint onto this, it's actually painting on layer 1. So now if I turn on and off layer 1, you see that the paint is actually part of layer 1. And you can undo that last move by pressing Command Z on your keyboard, but you have to be careful about doing too many paints, because if I do multiple strokes, I can only undo one stroke. There are ways to get rid of multiple things that you do to a layer in the history panel. So if you open up this history panel, which is right here, if you don't have it open, you can go to Window, History. But if I open that up, you see that this has a history of all the different things that I've done to this layer. So if I select this brush tool and delete, it gets rid of that last brush stroke. Or what I can do is select any part of this history and go back to that state of the layer. So this is where it was a rasterized layer, right when it became rasterized, but before I started brushing. Or I can go back to before it was even a rasterized image, back to when it was a smart object. And now I can go back and resize this and it won't get pixelated. So hopefully you understand how the brush works, and that really is for any of these tools or any effects. If you do it to a layer, it is stuck to that layer unless you are doing it to a new layer in between or on top, which is what we'll do for a lot of effects. Is we'll create a new layer like this, and then we'll add something like an exposure adjustment or a saturation adjustment, and this affects layers beneath it. But before we get too deep into all of that, I think we're going to leave it at that for now. The only other thing right here, which is something that I don't do too much, but right here at the top are ways to filter your layers. So you can click this button on the left and you can see that you can filter it by different types of aspects of that layer, by the layer name, mode, attribute, color, kind. And then we can select these different things over here, like filter for pixel layers, or filter by adjustment layer, or text layer, or shape layer. And we don't have any of those layers right now. We have smart objects though. And you can select one and then you can turn it on or off with this button on the right hand side. If you don't want it on, you can just leave that as it is. This is really beneficial if you have a really big project with lots of layers, lots of different text layers, different shape layers, adjustment layers, and you want to find one of those layers quickly. But for those of us that are just getting started, you typically don't have to mess around with that. So I'm just going to pop my layers panel right back into there. In the next couple lessons, we'll learn about some other ways that we can interact and edit multiple layers in our projects.